Hi folks, I decided to record this video after something that happened in Brazil a couple of weeks back that has been making headlines daily and has fired up a very passionate debate about remote work. I'm talking more specifically about this. So Itaú, which is the largest private bank in Brazil, has fired in a single day a large number of employees because of what they called a breach of trust. The bank hasn't disclosed the exact number of employees affected, but some entities that represent employees account to over 1,000 people, and all of them were working either partially or fully remote. So let's look at some of the facts and some of the claims, what the employees claim, what the bank claims, and see which lessons we can learn from that and which conclusions we can draw from that. Okay, so let's go through some of the facts that aren't being disputed by any of the parties. So first of all, it is important to understand that if we assume that indeed 1,000 people have been affected by this cut, this represents 1.15% of the total number of employees. And if we take into consideration only the employees who perform some kind of remote work, then this represents 2.8%. Right, and this is important because put things in perspective, as we'll see later on. It is also important to point out that the computers the employees were working with were provided by the bank. So they were managed by the bank, and the bank could remotely perform any kind of administrative action like installing applications, removing applications, restricting access, and so on. A couple of days after notifying the employees that they had been terminated, the bank disclosed that indeed keyboard, mouse, and browsing activities were being monitored, and this was used in the decision to terminate them. And this is perfectly plausible because, as I said earlier, the computers were provided by the employee and the employer, and they could fully manage them remotely. It is also important to understand that these employees were following working hours, so they had a fixed number of hours that they had to work. They were not being paid neither by performance nor by the clock time they were working on. And finally, when this became a huge controversy, the bank came to public to provide additional details of the decision process, and they exemplified that in one team in which the average activity of the team members was about 75%. The people who have been dismissed had an average of activity between 20 and 35%. So what does that mean? And this is what we'll see next. So we can see here a screenshot of a monitoring program similar to the one used by the bank. Certainly not the same one, but the one that we can use as a reference. Right, so on the top we have a bar with green and gray areas, right? This represents a work session. So for example, a day of work. And the green areas represent active sessions and the gray areas inactive sessions. And how are they calculated or defined as such? Well, if we look at the half bottom, we can see the screenshots. In this particular example, screenshots were being taken every 5 minutes, and this developer had two screens, right? So the screen on the left, he had the code he was working on, and the one on the right was like an ordinary desktop where he could open other applications like email, browsing, etc. So the screenshots were taken every 5 minutes. In this particular case, what happens is that these 5 minutes were divided into 30 slots of 10-second periods, right? And whenever there is some activity, mouse or keyboard activity within one of these 10-second time windows, then that section is marked as active. If there is no activity, then that section is marked as inactive, and the percentage that you see attached to the screenshots in the green bar represents the percentage of 10-second sections in which some activity was detected, right? So these are the percentages that I referred to in the previous slide. So we can see that it's very important to capture the metrics along with the screenshots, because if, for example, the employee is in a meeting or reading some documentation and there is no activity, at least we have some evidence that he was performing some work and there is some justification for not being active at that point. Okay, that said, let's see what the employees are claiming about this. Okay, many of the employees who have been affected by this cut were surprised by the decision to be terminated because they understood that they were perceived as high performant, right? Some of them had been promoted recently, some of them received prizes, and they kind of knew their relative performance compared to the co-workers. So they were very surprised by this sudden decision. But if we go back to the initial statement that the bank made, the decision was not based on performance. And now, when we start connecting the dots, what we can see is that there was an expectation on the number of hours they should work, the average activity they should have, and regardless of their performance, some of those people had an average that was much lower than the team's average, right? And in this context, one of the employees who have been interviewed in one of the articles that I read said that the reason why his activity was low was because he was using his own computer to work because the one provided by the bank was low. And I mean, that's a pretty bad justification, right? Because by using your personal computer to work when you've been given one by the employer, you are not only subject to this kind of problem of not having the proper metrics recorded, but you're also doing something that might pose other problems such as data security, especially for a bank, right? Some employees also say that we suspected that we've been monitored, but we didn't know how and what was being monitored, which is plausible considering that the computers were provided by the bank and they had, as I said earlier, the ability to manage them remotely and eventually install some silent agent that was capturing activity on the mouse and keyboard. And one final point, which is somehow surprising, was that they were communicated of the decision to terminate their contracts and that there hasn't been provided any feedback or any opportunity for them to respond, justify, or change the way how they were working. So my impression, and this is purely speculative, is that this was an initial layoff of the people the bank had no doubt should be terminated right now. Maybe there will be new waves of layoffs, and in those cases, maybe they behave a little differently. Maybe they provide some earlier feedback and they give the employees the opportunity to correct the course. But in this case, judging by the example they provided of the average activities, I believe they had no doubt about the decision. That's what it looks like to me. All right, moving on. Okay, so the union that represents those employees was in shock, and these are some of the statements that they have made in the media, right? They say that the number of dismissals is disproportionate. Well, it's not clear disproportionate to what, right? And I understand that if you look at the absolute number of firings, then it does look large. But again, you have to look into perspective, and if you're looking at 1.1/2.8%, then I would like to better understand what they see as disproportionate. I couldn't find any information on that. They also said that it's not reasonable to use monitoring and surveillance mechanisms to justify mass layoffs. I think there's a number of issues in this sentence. First of all, I wouldn't use the word surveillance. Monitoring, yes, but not surveillance. These are two very distinct terms. I would also dispute the use of the word mass here. I don't know if there's like a formal definition of what constitutes mass layoffs, if it's an absolute number or if it's a portion. But again, if you're looking in perspective and you see that it's 1.15% of the people who are being affected, would that classify as a mass layoff? And finally, they say it's not reasonable to use monitoring. But then, what would be the legitimate, reasonable mechanism for monitoring remote work? Right? This isn't clear to me. So both statements look a bit too generic, and I lacked more information about what exactly would be the alternative to what they are criticizing. And finally, they say that it can affect workers' mental health and create an oppressive environment. It wasn't also clear to me if they were referring to being monitored in a non-transparent way, which to some extent is understandable, right, as being bad, or if they're criticizing monitoring at all, right? If they're criticizing monitoring, then I can say that in my experience, that is not true, right? So the use of monitoring mechanisms by themselves, they do not create an oppressive environment. It's quite the opposite. Some people do frown upon those mechanisms at the beginning, but they become very natural. And I have never known anyone who quit the job because of that. So, and there are so many reasons why the work environment can be oppressive. I don't believe that the monitoring mechanisms are responsible for that. Okay, moving on. So let's see what the Brazilian laws say. And first of all, monitoring is allowed, and it must respect some fundamental rights such as privacy and intimacy. That's why I don't know of any company in Brazil that uses those mechanisms and have the camera capture enabled. I know of other companies that do that, but they are not based in Brazil. And finally, we do have a general data protection law, and according to this law, such actions must observe principles of transparency, purpose, necessity, and proportionality. Of all these principles, I think that transparency is the only one under debate. So if you're talking about employees working on equipment that have been provided by the employer to do the work, and that captures keyboard, mouse, and navigation activity, then I think the other ones are pretty much covered. And speaking of transparency, let's have a look of what the bank claims. Okay, so the bank says that the dismissals result from a thorough review of behaviors related to remote work and time tracking, and also that we identified patterns incompatible with our principles of trust, which are non-negotiable for the bank. So these reinforce the perception that there was an expectation, right? Certain number of hours, certain amount of average activity, and that hasn't been fulfilled by some of the employees. And that happened in a way that gave the employer the impression that the employees were being disloyal or trying to cheat or something like that. Furthermore, in response to the allegations that there was no transparency in the process, the bank says that the monitoring is supported by internal policies signed by employees themselves. Right, so I assume that maybe what happened here is that they're talking about one of those policies that everybody agrees to but no one reads, and where there wasn't any explicit mention of, keyboard, mouse, and navigation activities monitoring, right? Well, some of the lessons that we can learn from that is that, well, first of all, transparency is always good for everyone, right? The typical we use for that kind of monitoring application that I know and that I believe is the best is as a standard desktop application that the employee has the ability to start and stop whenever they want. In the application, they have the ability to start recording and stop recording whenever they want. So if there are, a certain number of hours that they have to to work in a day, if they have to start working at a specific hour, it doesn't matter. They have the ability to know exactly when they're being recorded. They have access to the content that is being recorded. So if, for example, you finished work, but then you start dealing with something personal in your work computer, then you should have the ability to review that and optionally delete the portion that you don't want tracked. Or if you forget to start recording, then you should have the ability to request manual time, which is typically approved by your manager. So again, transparency is a win-win, right? And I mean, here's the result, right? Here are the negative repercussions of what happened. And speaking of negative repercussions, I would like also to share that. Okay, this is an article that was published a few days after the issue, and the headlines essentially say, understand how companies snoop, quoted, into the life of those who do home office, right? And well, on one hand, they try to attenuate the weight of the word snoop by using quotes, but they're saying that they snoop into the lives of those who do homework. So no serious company is interested in that. So no serious company cares about what you do when you are outside your working hours. And I think that kind of headline that has some clear clickbait motivations, they do a disservice to the much needed debate about remote work, right? So monitoring mechanisms, they are good, they are needed, they're important, and they're not the reason why work becomes oppressive or companies snoop into the lives of anyone. And maybe this confusion about the importance of such tools is what explains the fact that some of the big techs are now retreating from remote work and requesting their employees to go back to the office. And I hope that when something like that happens, then this starts a discussion that helps mature the understanding about these tools, and that remote work works, and it's not because of a tool or a company that it will stop happening pretty much everywhere. So I don't know if you agree to my points of view. If you do or if you don't, please use the comment section for speaking up. If you like the content, please subscribe, like, let me know if there's anything else that you would like to know. And well, thank you very much for following up, and see you next time.